We are starting a new series focusing on an epic story, the story of the exodus of the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, through the desert to the promised land of God. This stands as a pivotal story in the history of the people of Israel, and specifically as it relates to their status under the Old Covenant as the chosen people of God. From the very beginning, they were given a promise as the people of God under the covenant that was made with Abraham. And this is a pivotal moment in that story. But the beauty of the story for us today is that this story stands not just as a narrative that provides us an account of this chapter in Jewish history, but it also represents, it illustrates, it demonstrates the nature of our journey as the new covenant children of God in our exodus from slavery through the desert to the promised land of God. This all happened, everything that we will read, everything that we will study, everything that we will reflect upon over the next several months, all of this happened so that we in the new covenant might have the lessons for our own sojourning. The events of the Exodus occurred so that we might have the lessons about our spiritual journey. And why can I say that so confidently? I want you to look at a remarkable passage that is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And it really is fascinating when you read it and you think of it in light of the story that we are looking at today. Paul writes and says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drank and rose up and play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." Why do I say it's a remarkable passage? It's incredible because the passage covers a good portion of the story of the Exodus. You have example after example after example of these different events that take place, of them going through the parting of the sea, of them grumbling about what they were eating, about when they needed water and Moses struck the rock. He's telling the full story of the Exodus that we will be covering over the next several months, and he makes declaratively the statement, these things happened to them as an example and were written down for our instruction. As we open up the book of Exodus over the next several months, never lose sight of the fact that while these chapters and verses are a recording of events that happened to the Israelites, they happened to the Israelites for us to learn in our own journey. They were written down for our instruction. And as we go through this series, we've given the series a very specific title, because I believe the overarching lesson of the Exodus is to follow God. The title of the series is Follow the Story of the Exodus. And ultimately, at the heart of the story is the commitment or the decision to follow God. As we unfold verse after verse, chapter after chapter, you're going to begin to see a very specific pattern unfold. When the Israelites chose to follow the leading and the word of God, there was victory. And when they rebelled, there was defeat. And we see the very first illustration of that reality in the very first chapter. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt when Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." When you stop there, you see that they're laying out basically the foundation, basically the story before the story. For those of you who've studied Genesis, or you've studied the life of Joseph, you know that this is about Joseph, who was rejected by his brothers, who was sold into slavery by his brothers because of jealousy. And when he was sold into slavery, he lands in Egypt. And through a series of incredible events, he found himself close to the Pharaoh. Because the Pharaoh had this dream, and he had this dream of destruction coming. And he didn't know what it meant, and Joseph was able to interpret that dream, and Joseph tells him, listen, there's famine coming. And there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of famine, and you need to prepare your people for that. In that interaction, the Pharaoh saw the wisdom that Joseph had, and so he establishes Joseph as essentially the savior of the people, the redeemer of the Egyptians. And because there was famine around, Joseph's family all comes, and that's where the entirety of the promise that was given to Abraham for his future nation come into Egypt. So he establishes this as the starting point of the promise of the covenant. But there's an interesting line that we just read. And that interesting line teaches us a lot about the posture that we can have when we have been given grace. It says here that there arose a king who knew not Joseph. Do you know what that specifically speaks to? It is this idea that this Pharaoh, this king, did not remember what Joseph did for them. That he did not have a heart of gratitude towards what had been given to him. That over the years, the pharaohs who remembered the gift of Joseph, they blessed the Israelites. They wanted the Israelites there. They out of their gratitude, cared for them. But there arose a king who did not remember what Joseph had done. And so he turned on them. I say that this is kind of a lesson that we can learn because there is so much damage that takes place when you do not live from a heart of gratitude. There's so much death and turmoil that takes place in our lives when we don't live from a place of gratitude. Whether it's gratitude we have one for another, but more importantly, whether it's gratitude we have for our Creator. See, we have been given things graciously, and what tends to happen in the heart of man, and if you study Jewish theologians, they really see this line as a perfect description of kind of the heart of man that doesn't embrace a heart of gratitude. When you don't realize what you've been given, when you take for granted the gifts that have been given to you, your heart almost always gets hardened. It's funny because there are studies that say that emotionally and spiritually, those who have a heart of gratitude are healthier, and those who do not have a heart of gratitude are less healthy. It bears out. And part of the problem, I think, for many Christians is we don't realize the grace that God has had for us, that God has given us. We take for granted all of these gifts that we've been given, and when we don't get what we want, we do what the Pharaoh did, which is out of fear try to protect and hang on and grasp something. And that causes us to make poor choices in our lives. that causes us to fall into and to propagate slavery and enslavement. That idea is a concept that we'll explore further on, but I want us from the starting point to realize that the start of all of this was a heart that did not have gratitude. And as a result, suffering followed. He said, "Come and let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the fields. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." It is in these words that I think we get the first lesson of the Israelites' Exodus experience. And I think that lesson is this, that even in suffering, we see God's sovereignty. You have to remember that the story we're reading right now and the story that we will read throughout the book of Exodus is all a continuation of God's promises to Abraham about his descendants becoming a great nation. If you read Genesis, the previous book, you're going to find that at the center of the story is this man named Abraham. And Abraham was chosen out of all the people to be brought to God and to be blessed of God. God tells him, "Listen, I am going to take you and miraculously make you a nation that is uncalculable, that is beyond the stars, that is beyond the sands of all of the seas." He tells him, "There is a promise I have for you." If you go to Genesis chapter 15, he's really showing the unfolding of the story of Exodus in that he gives them the promised land that they're going to go to. Literally in Genesis 15, he tells them of the promised land that they will inhabit, that his descendants will be a nation in. And so all of this is the unfolding of the promise of the Abrahamic covenant made for the people of Israel. It's all connected to that. It's all tied to that. But what's really interesting is what God says to Abraham in the middle of his promises. When he opens up and he says, listen, I am going to make a nation for you. I understand you're of great age. I understand your wife is old. I understand you have no children. But I'm going to give you a child, and from that is going to be a great nation. And when he concludes and says, and they will be given a promised land, and he lays it out from where they're going, in the middle of it, in the middle of that promise, God says these words. The Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." In the covenant promise is the promise of suffering. That in God's sovereign promise of a future that is held by him, of a future that is blessed by him, he tells them there will be suffering. And God uses that season of suffering for his purposes. What does it say? It says, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad." That God, in the midst of his sovereignty, in the midst of his plan, in the midst of his promise, in the midst of his covenant, says, there will be a time of suffering, and in that suffering, I will use it for my greater good. It is the declaration that what Pharaoh meant for evil, God meant for good. The affliction, the suffering, the hardship was not outside God's sovereign plan, but it was squarely within it. And when we hear this, when we realize that all that takes place for the Israelites in this story is for our lessons, when we hear this, it should engender in our spirits the truth that our hope needs to always reside not in favorable conditions, but in the promises of God. That they could sit in that moment of suffering and either get caught up in what was going on or remember to keep their eyes and their hearts on the promises that God has for them that are going to come out of this. We of the new covenant know that Jesus told us that in this life we will have many trials. We know he told us that we will face tribulations. That the world will hate us as it hated him. A part of God's covenant with us, like his covenant with Abraham, foretold pain and suffering. But in it still resides the promises of God. In this world, you have many troubles. But he said, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He declared, I will supply all your needs. He said, I will be your healer. He says, I am going to prepare a place for you. That each of these is the promise of our covenant with God. And in spite of the fact that we have the promise of suffering, we have the promises to carry us. My hope is not in favorable conditions, but in the promise of God. All the trials of the Israelites made them stronger. And when we put our focus on the promises of God in spite of our condition, there is a spiritual strength that can be developed only through the struggles. I'm telling you this from personal experience and from years of walking this road. There are lessons, there is growth, there is refining and reflection and renewal and redemption that only comes, that can only be learned in the struggle. There are levels of patience that you can't learn if everything's great. There is understanding the nature of God that can't be understood if everything is easy. But when we sit in the midst of the struggle and we keep our eyes on the promises, God works through all of that to give us something that we otherwise could never, ever, 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 ever have learned. I can tell you this from experience after experience after experience after experience. One of the most dangerous places to be is in a place of being a Christian who has never struggled. Because the moment you have a problem, the moment you have a struggle, you do what a lot of people in the stories of the Old Testament do, which is shake your fist at God and turn your back on him. It is through the hard times and the struggles that God teaches us the depth of faith in him. In fact, I think this is the message we find in 1 Peter chapter 1. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible, filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Do you see the posture he tells us to have? He's just literally saying, guys, there is a promised land waiting for you. There is this promise he has, so you keep your eyes focused on that. Because if you do, when you are in the midst of these trials, of these struggles, he says, yes, you are temporarily in struggles. And the crazy thing about it is, if you understand when Peter wrote this, he wrote this in the midst of some of the worst persecution of the church in its history. It was during the Herodian persecution. He says, yeah, so you do have a trial for a short while. But when you keep your eyes on the promise that God has for you, there is a refining that comes like the heat of gold. That as it heats up the gold and you can skim away the dross and it becomes purified, that's the faith you can have. That cannot come without the trials. This is the lesson. In God's sovereignty, we may face struggles. And it's okay. Keep your eyes on his promises, and your faith will grow. But as the Israelites grew stronger, in spite of the suffering, Pharaoh chose to redouble his efforts to thwart the promises of God. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. I want to stop here because there are numerous times in which we come across this in the stories of the Old Testament, the story of the New Testament, in which the hand of man chooses to destroy the baby. And it's fascinating because it is a consistent sin that is found in the heart of man. We see it here at the attempt to thwart the redemption of the Israelite people. We see it all throughout the Old Testament where the pagans would take children and sacrifice them, children sacrifice, baby sacrifices. The king of Moloch is mentioned in Scripture. One of the great lessons, I think, of the story of Abraham and Isaac, where Abraham brings Isaac up to the mountaintop and the altar and almost sacrifices him, and God stops him. One of the great lessons from that a lot of times we miss is this was the declaration from God teaching Abraham that his worship of the true God was different than his pagan neighbors. That we do not sacrifice children, we do not kill babies to our God. This is a consistent thing that we see, not just in Scripture. I mean, we get into the New Testament where they did the same thing to try and kill Jesus. But I want you to understand this, that this seems to be something that is consistent in the heart of man. Not just throughout the Old Testament, not just throughout the New Testament, but in our history this has taken place. We saw it with the Romans and the Greeks. So one of the things that caused the growth of the church in the first century was that the Christians would come in and save these children that they would leave out to die. We can see it even as we move through human history, where here in North America, you had natives that would sacrifice children, hundreds, thousands. Part of why I say this is because I think you need to realize that this is an instrument of the demonic. There's many theologians that would tie all of this to Genesis chapter 2, the curse that was given after the fall of man, where God turns to the serpent and says there will be enmity between you and your seed and the woman and her seed, meaning the children. That this is the fruition of the curse that the demonic that gets caught into the heart of man. I say all this because whenever I read these stories, I see it as a continuation of something that takes place not just throughout the Bible, not just throughout history, but in our culture even today. And I'm talking, obviously, about the demonic actions of our society, which is abortion. We, because of the influence of Judeo-Christian values, don't just take babies and kill them. But I believe that Satan has worked his way into our culture and into our society in a way to convince us that in some way that abortion is something that is to be accepted. And I believe it is the tool of Satan to manifest this demonic in our culture and our society. And we need to stand against it. The beautiful thing that I see whenever I read this is that whenever this is here, God raises up those who stand against the schemes of Satan. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? And let the male children live." The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." As you read this story, you find here, I think, our second lesson. And it is probably the most important lesson we need to learn. And I say it's the most important lesson we need to learn because I believe it is the most important lesson we can learn about defeating the tyrant. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. It's interesting because here we see a confluence of early church teachers' interpretation of this passage with a traditional Jewish understanding of it. Many early church teachers saw Pharaoh as a representation of our internal passions that enslave us. It really makes sense that that's the lesson you would draw from this when you see the concept of slavery connected over and over in the New Testament to sin and internal passions. In Romans 6, Paul writes and says, "When you present your body in obedience to sin, you are a slave to sin." In Titus 3, he writes and says, "For we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another." And Jesus puts it even plainer in John chapter 8 when he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." So obviously, it makes perfect sense that Christian teaching would see Pharaoh's enslavement as representative of our sinful passions. But this is the understanding that Jewish scholars also have. They look at this passage and they see the midwives providing the lesson to address both external and internal tyrants. The external is Pharaoh's. And for many of us, we can find ourselves having other people's wills impressed upon us, forcing us and moving us beyond that which is the call and the promise of God. And that's represented in the external tyrant who is Pharaoh. But they also talk about the internal tyrant, which is our sinful passions. And the lesson that both the early church fathers and Jewish scholars arrive at is that the fear of the Lord overcomes all tyranny. Pharaoh says, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. A reasonable way to read this would be to say the midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. That they had an understanding, they had a respect, they had an awe for God more so than that of the Pharaoh. When you consider the power that Pharaoh wielded, what he could have done to the midwives. But the midwives had their eyes not on the consequences that could come from not bending a knee to the tyrant, but they had their eyes on the consequences that come when you obey God. When we make the things of this world bigger than the majesty of God the authority of God, the greatness of God, we will always choose the tyrants of our slavery. This is exactly why Proverbs 9:10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." What ultimately is wisdom? Wisdom is knowing what choices to make at just the right time. And what we discover here is when you have a profound respect for God, when you have a fear of his authority, it will always lead you to the right choices in your life. This is the heart behind Christ's challenge in Matthew chapter 10. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light. And what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. It's a fascinating declaration from Jesus in that he gives us the broader understanding that, listen, we need to look to this world and we need to look to the tyrants of this world or the tyrants within us and realize that we should fear the results of what God can do us far over that of what the world can do to us. But it becomes even more poignant when you realize what he's talking about here is he says, listen, what I have told you, how I've told you to live, declare it loudly, live it loudly. Declare it from the mountaintops, from the rooftops. Don't worry about what they can do to you in response to what you're saying or how you're living, because you should have a greater fear of God than of man. What a clarifying declaration. Are you more worried about what people think about you or what people say about you or what people might do to you than you are concerned about the thoughts of the creator of the universe? In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, heading into chapter 7, I think Paul brings this all together with these words. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Almighty Lord. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in what? The fear of God. In this declaration, Paul ties directly the promises of God to us fearing the Lord. He's saying, follow after the things of the Lord. Do what the Lord would call you to do. And you will do that if you have a profound fear of God. And when you do, his promises will be revealed to you. Each one of us needs to live in a place of deep and profound respect for the authority of God over this world and over our lives. You will always lose if you fear anything above your fear of God, and you will always win if you fear God above everything else. That fear of God will cause you to follow God and not your passions. When we follow God, no matter the odds, the fulfillment of his promise always follows. This is what takes place when you read into chapter 2. Immediately following the willingness of these midwives to fear God over fearing Pharaoh, the birth of Moses comes. Moses is the type of the Redeemer Jesus. And the redemption of God's people came directly because these people, these midwives, feared God. Every day, in every circumstance, Christ stands before us as the instrument of our redemption, the sent Redeemer. Whether you are here living in your own ways, controlled by your passions, never having given your life to Christ, he is here willing to be your Redeemer. If you are a Christian and you are caught in your sin, trapped in fear, enslaved by anger, whatever it is to which you are a slave, he is here now to be your Redeemer. And all it takes for every single one of us is to arrive at a place where you fear the Lord above all else. And it's important to understand this. The fear of the Lord isn't about terror. It's about recognizing his magnificent supremacy and finding your proper place in relationship with him. It's an acknowledgement that he is creator and we are creation. It is a realization that he has authority not only over us, but over all things. And when we arrive at that place, it is easy for us to shun the things of the flesh because we want the things of him. It is easy for us to find peace in the midst of turmoil because we know he is our ultimate promise of peace. If you're not a believer, fearing the Lord means acknowledging that he is creator and you are creation. It means coming to the place and the realization that you have been living your life for yourself. That he's not on the throne in your life, he's not king of your life, but you are. And all the things you've been trying and all the things you've been doing will never, ever lead you to the promise you seek. It will never lead you to the peace you desire, the love you're pursuing, the joy you want. It's only found in your Creator. When we talk about repenting of our sin, that's ultimately what it is. It's all encapsulated in that. It is looking to God and saying, God, I am so sorry that I've been living my life irrespective of you. I've been living my life as me on the throne, and I've not humbled myself before your majesty, recognized your magnificence, and feared you as Lord and Creator. And so today, I give my life to you. I follow you. I know who I am in relationship to you. It's ultimately the same pathway for those of us who are believers. Whether we're struggling in our sin, or we're struggling in fear, or we're gripped by anger and bitterness. It is all wrapped up in the fact that we are not acknowledging God as Lord over all. We are not fearing him. We have put our hope and our faith in other things. He is the Lord. Whatever sin you pursue will not give you what he can give you. He will give you the hope. He will give you the love. When we as Christians get trapped in our sinfulness, it is because we've lost sight of his majesty. When we as Christians live in bitterness or anger, it's because we've lost sight of who we are before him and are not living in the fear of the Lord and what he has done for us. When we live in fear, it's because we've lost sight of the fact that he is majestic over all, and we can trust him and we can rest in him. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, and it is the beginning of all freedom. Your Redeemer is here. He's ready to set you free from all that is entangling you. And the pathway is to respond to him in respect, in fear of his magnificence and his sovereignty.